it, but it's coming to an end. We tax to the hilt, we can't tax anymore. Then we borrow to the hilt. We can't run our foreign policy or our domestic spending policies without borrowing from China. This is a failed policy and it's going to collapse. And all you have to do is go out and even today, look at the financial news and look at what's happening to the dollar. That is a bad sign. And this is what has happened historically throughout hundreds, if not thousands, years of history, is that countries that overdo things overseas and they overdo things at home, it used to be called bread and circuses and guns and butter, eventually the money is destroyed. The Soviet system came down not because we beat them in a hot war. They defeated themselves because they had an economic system that failed. We have an economic system that is very friable, and it cannot last because it's based on deficit financing, borrowed money, and printing press money. The biblical admonition of fair weights and measures was worked into our Constitution when the Founding Fathers said, nothing but gold and silver should be legal tender, there should be no central bank, and you can't create money out of thin air. The great danger of overspending is that of a runaway currency and a devaluation of the dollar. And because that is coming, we can anticipate that we are in for a lot more economic problems before us. At the same time that we do all this and we run into troubles, whether it's troubles overseas, the threat of terrorism or whatever, these are the conditions that have been set up so often throughout history when we lack our concern about our personal liberties. And we do not have to sacrifice liberty. The argument that, oh, now because we're threatened, that we have to be under these concerns, we have to give up so much freedom in order to be safe and secure. You know, Benjamin Franklin was explicit, and I think he was absolutely right. If you do that, if you give up personal liberties for more safety, you end up with nothing, neither one. There is no reason ever to give up personal liberty in order to be safe and secure. This is like saying, you know, we have an emergency down in New Orleans. Oh, well, we need safety down in New Orleans, and we need to make sure that we take care of it. We're going to rely on central economic planning in Washington. We'll appropriate $50 billion. And where did the $50 billion go? It went down a rat hole. I mean, they bought trailers that were left out in the weather and not used. They passed out money to people who didn't even exist. Central economic planning doesn't work. But what else did they do? Because of the concern and the fright of this emergency, the federal government came in and took away the guns from the property owners and kept the property owners from going in and protecting their property. So once we become so fearful that the government will take care of us, it's too easy to give up our liberties. This is what's been going on, and we've been good as conservatives condemning the liberals who say, well, somebody might fall through the cracks. So therefore, we have to sacrifice economic liberty. We have to concede to have this excessive taxation and these deficits and the inflation. But it doesn't work. Eventually, the country goes bankrupt. This is what we're facing today. We're on the verge of a bankruptcy. The other night when we had a debate, the questioners introduced the question by saying that 70% of the American people believe we're either in recession or going into recession. And to put our heads in the sand and say, oh, that's not true, everything is okay, I think will hurt us as a political party and will not help us solve our problems whatsoever. And if we do the right thing and recognize these problems, the answers are not that difficult. All we have to do is live within the bounds of the Constitution. Now, there will be disagreements on many issues. For instance, the issue of education. I take the position that most Republicans took for a long time. They're not so adamant anymore. But I don't even think we should have a Department of Education, period. Yeah. But if we are going to have a Department of Education, if we are going to have the federal government involved, we should never do it by just ignoring the Constitution. No, the Constitution deserves to be changed, it deserves to be modified, but it was meant to be slow and tedious, and when it's necessary, we should do that. But just to ignore it, and that is what's happening, whether it's with declaration of war or taking over medical care, taking over the educational system, what is left? What is left to our First Amendment? What are we saying about it today that our ministers can't even say certain things in the pulpit? Where's the First Amendment? They have no right to come down on our ministers. There's been a movement in Washington for several years now that I have fought, and many of you in this audience, I'm sure, have tried to help me, and I thought I was making progress, but unfortunately we did not win this issue. Several years ago, they introduced this notion that we will have mandatory mental health testing of every single child in public school. I condemn that. We should not permit that. We now today have over 2 million kids undertaking these psychotropic drugs. I'm a physician. I understand some of the problems. I also am sympathetic that I've known some children that have been helped. But when the government gets in the medical business, mandating inoculations, preventing you from alternative health care, and taking your nutritional items and putting those into the hands of the drug companies, or mental health testing, which ends up putting more kids on these drugs, there's something wrong with that, and the principle is unsound. The principle that has been violated, that we as a people have permitted our government to become the parents. The parents are in charge of the children, not the government. I strongly endorse the notion of personal liberty. That is what our government and our country and our Constitution is all about. I am also one of great confidence that if we were left alone, that we had responsibility for ourselves, both personally, what we study and read, and our religious values, as well as what we put into our bodies, that we would act more responsibly than the federal government and the bureaucrats. But I'm also convinced that they don't know what to do, and they don't know how to run our lives, they don't know how to run the economy, and I don't believe they know how to run the world either. So if we do this, we will have a much better society. Sure, some people are going to make mistakes. Sure, some people, even though they think they're self-reliant, might not take care of themselves as well as they should. But in freedom, freedom assumes responsibility for one's own actions, whether it's in the material sense or in the spiritual sense. We're all responsible for our action. To assume otherwise means that we concede way too much to the government. Now, if we want to be humanitarians, we have to argue for freedom and liberty and the marketplace and sound money and no eminent domain and all these issues which are dear to us. If we could argue that case, then we become the humanitarians. Because if you look at economic history, the only way famine was ended, or the only way that poverty was ended, was with capitalism and freedom and property rights. And how come we have lost this fight? How come so often we as conservatives and Republicans have conceded to the Democrats and have gone along with their entitlement system? Because we're frightened to say, oh, you lack compassion, you don't care, and therefore if you vote against prescription drug programs, that if you vote against S-chip, therefore you don't care about the children. Well, if you truly care about the children, if you truly care about and be compassionate about the well-being of everybody, and then putting the responsibility on each and every one of us as individuals and believe in the family and responsibility of the parent, then we argue the case for freedom and free markets and sound money, and we stick to the Constitution. We don't rely and say, well, there will be a few that will be needed. The truth is, when you have free markets and sound money, there's a greater amount of prosperity. I started medicine when we didn't have the government involved. Medical care was a lot cheaper, and the government wasn't involved. I worked in church hospitals. Nobody was ever turned away. Today, no charity hospitals very often anymore, and everybody gets charged the maximum. Medical care is in shambles because the corporations have taken over, and now the alternative, it looks like the government's taken over. We have to look at each and every one of these problems and say, let freedom take over, let the individuals assume responsibility. We can do it. All we have to do is believe in America, believe in freedom, and believe in the Constitution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.